everyone. My name is Danielle Grego, and I'm the Education Program Coordinator with the State Historical Society of Missouri. Thanks for joining us today for the fifth installment of Missouri Mysteries, where Assistant Director of Research Sean Rost will be exploring the mystery of Collins's coal mine. If you've missed our other installments or other virtual programs, you can catch them on demand on our website at shsmo.org. This virtual program and all of our virtual programs are made possible by the generous support of our members and donors. You can view our website to see how you can add or renew your support. Today's program, we will be allowing questions at the end of the presentation. We are using Zoom webinar, so we can't hear or see you, but we will see your questions coming in, and we look forward to answering as many as we can today. Now I would like to turn it over to Sean Rost so we can get started with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the fifth installment of a series which I didn't think was going to get this far when I first proposed it, but I'm happy to see that it has had a long lifespan and that you are joining us today. If you are a regular follower of Missouri Mysteries, you know that we've covered everything from Momo the Missouri Monster to the Blue Man of the Ozarks, the Hornet Spook Lights, the Piedmont Lights, the Carcagni of the Ozarks, and finally last year we talked about the curious case of Norma Short. Those were all 20th century stories, and I decided for this year's installment to go back in time a little bit and go back to the 19th century and look at a mystery involving the town of Moberly, Missouri, and what was called the mystery of the Collins coal mine. Now, it begins on April 8th, 1885. In the edition that day of the St. Louis Evening Chronicle, there was a lengthy article about a mystery that was uncovered in the town of Moberly, Missouri. And essentially what the article gets into, as you can kind of see here on the left, a series of sizable headlines there chronicling the discovery of a mystery in the bottoms of this coal mine in Moberly, Missouri. For readers of that day of April 8th, 1885, they would have uncovered the following information about this shocking and amazing discovery down in the depths below Moberly, Missouri. So according to the article, in late March, early April of 1885, a man by the name of Tim Collins rushed into nearby Moberly to alert his friends and business partners about a shocking discovery in his nearby coal mine. Now, Collins had operated this coal mine for more than a decade now. In fact, early records indicate that he began mining in and around Moberly in the early 1870s. And in fact, he's in the 1870 census listed as a miner, a coal miner, or being involved in the coal business there in Randolph County and in the community of Moberly. Now, so far up until that point, his efforts at coal mining had been very challenging. He had made little progress. He had dug to a depth of about 250 feet, and investors had come and gone over the span of time. He had investors in the East Coast. He had some from St. Louis, and even some from his former town that he had grown up in and lived in for a period of time of Sedalia, Missouri. Now, in this retelling, Collins had finally dug down to a deep enough depth to begin the excavation of coal, and that is where he came across a mysterious cavern. And upon exploring it, realized what he had and called back and went into town to tell his friends and associates of what he found. Now, his friends and his associates were very suspicious. Someone coming out of the coal mine saying they had found a mystery was a little unnerving for them, but they nevertheless accompanied Collins into the mine to explore for themselves. Now, the article of April 8th, 1885 lists the following individuals being part of this exploration party into Collins' coal mine. Charles F. Campbell, a prominent real estate dealer in Moberly, R.A. Wilson, another real estate dealer and a coal mine operator, Gideon Morehouse, a former miner, David Coates, who was the city recorder, George Keating, who was the city marshal, George Barrett, who had been a Kansas merchant who had also been affiliated with the railroad, Grafton Gorsey, who was a local printer, and the writer of the article, a newspaper correspondent listed only as Estes. They all went into the mines and slowly descended their way down to the full depths until they reached the cavern. It is there that they discovered a small opening in the cavern, large enough for only one person to fit through at a time. The story recounts how it took them over an hour to fit through this tiny hole one by one, but once climbing through, they laid their eyes upon the contents of the mysterious caverns. Now, what did they find? They claimed in the article that they had come across the ruins of a remote but advanced civilization, and that the chamber that they were in had actually been dug out and was of containing man-made supports, these large pillars and masts holding up the ceiling. Each member, as it was retold, could not contain their excitement and began to explore, quote, this vast cavern of indescribable, awe-inspiring wonder. They began to collect materials that they found in and around them for the journey back up to the surface, right? No one is going to believe them unless they bring materials back to the surface to show off what they had found. So they began to chip away at portions of the wall, collecting those, planning to bring those back to the surface. And those were, quote, blocks of irregular shape, cubical, quadrangular, triangular, and even oval, but they were put there by the skill of those who understood the art of masonry. As they explored further, they found a structure within this large cavern that they estimated to be 62 feet by 100 feet and 20 to 25 feet high. It appeared to be a room or some sort of outbuilding because it had signs of doorways that had since long essentially rusted away and rotted away for the wooden doors. They began to kind of take pieces of the door and stow those away as well to take them back to the surface. And they found that the room contained a number of tables and benches, indicating workshops had been used by various early craftsmen. And they began to collect tools that they found in the nearby area as well. As they were exploring further and further into this room and collecting more and more materials, Charles Campbell went further. He couldn't contain his excitement in the retelling, it says, and he explored into a neighboring room. And it was there that he gazed upon a number of small statues lined up along various walls of a neighboring room. Upon reaching out for one to feel it, to touch it, to hold it, the statue fell down upon him and actually pinned him for a period of time. He let out a concerned yell and alerted the other members of the exploration party to locate him, which they did, removing the statue and thus getting him out from under it. Now, the falling statue was not the only danger that was left for them within the mine. They had been exploring for several hours. They had no concept really of time being down there in the depths of the cavern. And they quickly figured out that it had been several hours had passed since they had gone down there. And that the lights and the candles and from the oil lamps that they had affixed to their lanterns and to their hats were beginning to draw low on oil. And so they began to try to figure out what is the best way to continue the exploration, but also get back to the surface as soon as possible. They decided that they would make a second party trip later on at a later date, and that they needed to get back up to the surface. So ultimately, they decided to depart, extinguishing some of the lanterns to save them in case they needed them later on, with only a few members left of carrying lanterns to get their way back out. It was in this last part of the cavern, as they began to make their way out, that the group came upon quite possibly the most startling discovery of the entire trip. They came across a large courtyard with stone streets, indicating that this had been some sort of underground city. And it was there that they came across a fountain that was still flowing water throughout portions of the fountain. The group tasted the water and described it later on as being sweet, but having a very limestone, kind of stony taste to it. Near the fountain, one of the exploring parties, George Barrett, came across kind of the most startling revelation of all, which was a large skeleton laying near the base of the fountain. Now, in the retelling of the story, another gentleman, Gideon Morehouse, conveniently actually had a measuring, what today we would call measuring tape, but some sort of string that he could measure the size of materials. and he draped it across the skeleton, measuring both the femur and the tibia, the two largest bones within the body. The femur, it was said, measured roughly 54 inches, or would be 4.5 feet, and the tibia measured roughly 50 inches, or would be 4 feet 3 inches. Now, for context, the average human femur is only 18 inches, or about 1.5 feet, and the average human tibia is about 15 inches, or about 1 foot and 3 inches. So, in the judgment of the group exploring it, they said that the skeleton must have been from a human or an animal that was 3 times the size of the average human. Now, while this was astounding to them, and they were certainly interested in bringing the skeleton back to the surface, they again began to worry about the remaining oil that was left in their overall lamps. And they collected what little bone fragments they could and headed for the surface. Um, when they finally reached the surface, it was the early morning hours. They had been there for several hours overnight, and they left behind what they called, quote, the city of the dead, end quote. And by their estimates, when they gazed upon the morning sun, the group had been down there for roughly 13 total hours. Now, the follow-up article to this was also published in the Evening Chronicle soon after this, in which a second exploring party, including Charles McGowan, George Conway, I.B. Forney, C.A. Bridges, and several other unnamed individuals, went back down into the cave again. And this time they came across the petrified remains of several individuals. If you've seen Pompeii, you kind of get the idea of what they're referring to. Essentially, the outlines of people etched forever in kind of lava deposits in stone. And they also found objects that resembled idols, religious figurines, statues of humans kneeling before these idols, and even a stream running through portions of this cavernous space. The newspaper said, quote, the whole affair has set the community ablaze with excitement, and various speculations exist regarding the wondrous discoveries made. Of course, it all reads and sounds like a story pertaining to mythology, but truth is mighty and will prevail, and the doubtful individuals has only to call when he can be shown the wonderful underground objects as described above, end quote. Now, news of this discovery did not stay within the pages of the St. Louis Evening Chronicle. In fact, within a short period of time, this story spreads not only across Missouri, but across the United States and even across portions of the world. Soon after, we have a number of articles that are appearing in local papers. So here is on the left is the follow-up story from the Evening Chronicle on the 9th of April, 1885, discussing the second exploratory party that went into the cavern. April 10th, 1885, the St. Louis Evening News published the middle article there. Deep down, a city discovered 360 feet under the ground, the most startling discovery of the age, and basically reprinted what the Evening Chronicle had published a few days prior. And then on the 6th of April, notice the date there, we'll come back to that shortly, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat gave it a short, brief overview of the story of the Collins coal mine and what had been discovered there within the depths of the mine. Now, as I said, the story gains major following across the United States, and soon enough, the story is printed in various newspapers nationwide. On the top left, we can see an article captioned from the New York Times. We can see below that another Pompeii, a very strange discovery, if it be true, from the Wilkes-Barre Times Leader in Pennsylvania. The Hamilton Spectator in Canada, stranger than Sinbad's yarns, discovery of a subterranean city in the Wild West. And then finally, interestingly enough, a man by the name of Britton A. Hill comes up quite a bit in a number of these various retellings of the incident to give it kind of a celebrity connection to the overall story. Britton A. Hill was a known political leader in the city of St. Louis. He was actually born in New Jersey in 1816. He grew up in New York, later became an attorney in the state of New York, and moved to St. Louis in the 1840s. He helped found what was later called the Greenback Labor Party and was a very strong advocate of financial issues, including the adoption of greenback money or paper money after the Civil War. And he actually goes campaigns for Congress in 1882 as a candidate of the Greenback Labor Party. He was a notable figure in and around St. Louis and in the United States. Very famous friends were associated with him, including the president Abraham Lincoln. Um, Britton A. Hill was said to be an associate of Tim Collins and that he had financed part of the coal mine early on, but had later dropped out because essentially he was not producing the coal and the value that he wanted it to be associated with. So he eventually dropped out as a partner in the coal business. Now, you'll notice within some of these articles, there are callbacks to different parts of kind of mythology and story making in different parts of the world. Right here with the Wilkes-Barre Times Leader, you see another Pompeii. This is drawing back to what had been a developing story over several generations. The city of Pompeii had been essentially covered by Mount Vesuvius when it had erupted in 79 AD. And what is now today affiliated with the kind of the story of Pompeii and the lost city of Pompeii was breaking news in a lot of ways in the course of the 1800s. In fact, the first discoveries of Pompeii were in the 1500s, and really over the next several centuries, there were repeated exploration parties sent into Pompeii to slowly uncover more and more of these communities. So by the mid 1800s, the exploration and discoveries of Pompeii were still on the front pages of various newspapers across the country. Additionally, you'll see a lot of people referring to the story as the American Pompeii, but actually it's the second American Pompeii to be discussed. A number of articles in and around the 1800s also discussed the exploration and discovery of the ruins of the Mayan Empire in portions of present-day Mexico, and that was also put into context of being an American Pompeii at the same time. So that name comes up in context with these various explorations that were going on in the 1800s. Thus, the idea that something could be found below the earth was not out of the question to a lot of people in Missouri and American society there in the late 19th century. Now, almost immediately after the story comes out, remember, it's published on April 8th, 1885. Within 2 days, there are already rumors circulating that the story is, in fact, a hoax. The Globe Democrat, which had published a story on April 6th about the discovery of the Collins coal mine, 4 days later publishes a story entirely fictitious, the true story of Mr. Tim Collins's coal mine, in which the story is discussed that while a number of relics have been brought up to the surface, many allege that these had actually been found in nearby Native American mounds and had been placed in and around the mine to suggest that they had been discovered down there, but really they were not dating to the actual mine cavern itself. Soon after, a number of newspapers began to note how only the Globe Democrat or the Evening Chronicle had any information about this mine, and it seemed to them to be a bit dubious that only one or two newspapers were breaking the story and no one else had any follow-up articles or anything related to the overall mine. Finally, Tim Collins is tracked down and he gives his version of the story to several newspapers, claiming that he knew nothing of this discovery in his mind, that he was not connected to it in any way, that he did own the mine, but that it was not even drilled to a depth that the articles claimed the discoveries were made at. He also claimed that Britton A. Hill was never an investor in his mine, and that all the various stories were, quote, unadulterated humbug, as he said, end quote, and he charged it to the origins of bad whiskey and a love of lying. Now, this does not stop the stories from continuing. You have to remember in this day and age, news travels slowly. And in fact, in a lot of communities across Missouri, there are weekly newspapers. So thus, by the time that the story goes out in the April 8th edition of the Evening Chronicle, a lot of newspapers are not going to pick that up and publish that until a week or 2 weeks after that. So even though this hoax rumor begins to circulate, within a few days of the original article, you still have newspapers throughout Missouri publishing about Collins's coal mines and the discovery there well throughout the remaining month of April. In fact, we have articles from the 15th of April, the 21st of April, still published about this discovery in the Collins coal mine. So thus it kind of continues on in that way going forward. Now, upon hearing that Tim Collins is disputing the story, people were calling it a hoax. The Evening Chronicle doubled down on the story, arguing that it trusted the newspaper correspondent Estes, who had sent them the story, and that it had done its due diligence. It had checked with residents in Moberly who all confirmed that they could confirm the story of this mystery down in the Collins coal mine, and that they had checked the names of individuals and confirmed that they were factual. They were real people, and they trusted them in their retelling of the events. So on April 10th, as the Globe Democrat goes to press saying it is a fictitious error, the Evening Chronicle fights back against the Globe Democrat, saying that they trust their reporting and they believe it to be true. Now, only a day later, April 11th, 1885, the newspaper has to concede that the hoax rumors seem to be increasingly likely as more and more information has circulated that makes them feel wary about what is being recorded and what is being reported about the overall story of Collins's coal mine. So, to recap again there, April 8th, the story is published. April 11th, it is declared to be a potential hoax by the same newspaper in 3 days. And yet, for the entire month of April, this story circulates internationally that there is a discovery of a lost civilization, of tools, of workshops, of outbuildings, of skeletons, of petrified forms of humans, fountains, rivers, gold, treasure, all sorts of things in Tim Collins's coal mine. It just shocking to a lot of people, and takes a long time for the story to circulate that it is in fact potentially a hoax. Now, if things are being confused right now and we don't know what's going on here, what are the facts to be perceived from a story that lasted 3 days in the press but had a much longer lifespan than that? What are the facts of the story? What can we confirm is true? What can we confirm as potentially being a hoax? Well, let's dive into that here for the latter half of the presentation. So first and foremost, coal mining. There was a Tim Collins coal mine in Moberly. Today, it has been estimated that it sat along North Alt Street in the northeastern portion of Moberly. Later on, portions of the property would be sold to neighboring residents who would build homes upon the property. So as far as I can tell, there is no remnants of the mine anymore, but it would have existed there. And coal mining, in fact, was very prominent throughout portions of Missouri there in the 19th century. While Missouri often gets a lot of attention for its lead mining and zinc mining in portions of the lead belt, just south of St. Louis there, places like Washington County, Madison County, St. Francis County, Iron County, and portions of the tri-state mining district down near Joplin in Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. Coal mining was very prominent throughout portions of northern Missouri. And some of the earliest coal mines in the region date to the 1840s. The images here are some highlighting some coal mines in the area. The top two are from Macon County, circa about 1900. The bottom left there is from a coal mine operation in Cooper County. And the bottom right is a collection of miners seen outside of the mining location there in Adair County in northern Missouri. So the coal mine part is true. Tim Collins owned a coal mine. He owned it in Moberly. He had been working on it for roughly 15 years by this point, and that coal mining was not something that was unusual to Missourians there in the late 19th century. Okay, well, let's go to the next part of it. The article that was posted in the Evening Chronicle on April 8th, 1885, was attributed to a writer by the name of Estes, a newspaper correspondent. We can confirm that this Estes person is a real person. John W. Estes was his full name, and John W. Estes was a young newspaper reporter and editor for the Moberly, Missouri Headlight. He had purchased an interest in the Headlight in 1884 with a gentleman by the name of John G. Provines, and they managed the paper at the time of the story coming out about the Tim Collins coal mine. Now, Estes was seen as being a very promising young reporter. In fact, we can see from the Columbia Herald Statesman there, the medical article from 1885, he was, quote, a young man, though he is evidently very industrious and very capable, indeed one of the most promising news reporters in the entire country. So very, very promising news about him. He would later go on to manage not only the Headlight, but when he moved to Texas later on in life, managed a newspaper, or at least a number of newspapers, down and around San Antonio, Texas. And even in a period of time later on, after the story had broken, he was even given the responsibility of being a reporter for Moberly, Missouri, in the Missouri General Assembly, basically covering legislative affairs and legislative news for the newspapers of Moberly and reporting back. So seemingly he's a real person. He exists. He is about 22 years of age when the story is broken. John G. Provines was 30 years his senior. By this point in time, he was in his 50s. He was a well-educated man. He was very well-spoken. He was very well-versed in history and literature and art and mythology and religion. And he was very well respected in the community for his newspaper expertise as well as his overall knowledge. He was one of the few kind of major educated people there at the time and was seen as a very respectable resident of Moberly. Thus, we can confirm that Estes, real person. So again, coal mining, confirmed. Estes, real person. Finally, as the Evening Chronicle had done in its initial reporting, they had looked out to see the original searching parties, the exploration parties in the coal mine, if they were real people. Of the number of individuals listed, I can also confirm that these are real people. Here at the State Historical Society of Missouri, not only do we have issues of the Evening Chronicle, but we also have an 1884-1885 Moberly City Directory. And going through the names of the individuals listed, I was able to confirm all but one of them was not only a resident of Moberly in 1885, but that the occupations listed next to their names in these newspapers were also their actual occupations that they had in the city of Moberly, whether it be miner, whether it be real estate agent, whether it be someone involved in the coal business, whether it be, city recorder, city marshal. These were all verified and proven to be true. So then if these things are all true about the story, where's the hoax at? What is not true? Where is the untruth, I guess you could say, in the mix of all of it? Well, what it comes down to is ultimately when the Evening Chronicle had to recant its story, when they had to declare that there was evidence of a possible hoax on April 11th, 1885, they basically detailed a large article discussing why there was evidence of a possible hoax. And I'm going to read some excerpts here from the article for you because it gives a fascinating perspective upon what happened. So when they initially said there was evidence of a hoax, the Chronicle reported, quote, "The Chronicle is seriously indisposed today. It feels like a little boy who had lost his first jackknife or a little girl who had lost her first doll. The Chronicle's heart is broken and it cannot be comforted. It has met a heavy and bewildering loss. It is sorely bereaved. It is no solace that others have met with a similar calamity. It is a sackcloth and ashes and condolence from other sufferers who have a fellow feeling, knowing how it is themselves is of no avail. For many years, the Chronicle must do penance and crucify the tenderest sensitivities. The idols and gods have been cruelly destroyed. The shrine at which it had just learned to worship no longer contains a god whose origin antedates the remotest traditions of history, but is filled by a modern descendant of the canine species. The Chronicle went on basically to say how embarrassed it was by the fact of it, and then began to relay essentially what had occurred overall to cause such an incident. And they tied it back to John W. Estes. They noted that on April 1st, 1885, note the date, April 1st, 1885, John W. Estes sent the following letter to the Evening Chronicles. Quote, "Dear Sir, some excitement has been created here by the discovery in the bottom of an old coal mine 360 feet deep, a subterranean passage. I have, with a party of friends, just returned from these cyclopean deeps after having been entombed several hours. It is a remarkable discovery, explainable only by the laws of science, and outdoes the experience of all delvers in the earth. The bones of a monster creature were found in this cavern of long buried ages. A lot of tools, I guess they are tools, and images of strange gods were found by the score. The local papers here have passed the matter with meager mention, but I think it will prove a sensation for you. I have written it up in detail. It will take 2 columns in the Chronicle. What I want to know is, can you use it all at the comical 2 cents per line? If so, you shall have it exclusively. Wire me at once. Yours respectively, John W. Estes." End quote. Now, in its own retelling, the Evening Chronicle said it inquired of Estes to produce the said article. When it came in, the fellow reporters and editors of the Evening Chronicle were deeply interested in the overall story, but they were hesitant. One, they wanted to confirm the information was truthful and factful by connecting with residents of Moberly to confirm its story. But also, as they later said, they were eager to focus on the municipal elections in St. Louis that year and were worried that the St. Louis election coverage would take up too much space in the newspaper to run such a sizable article. So they waited. Now, as we saw back before, on April 6, 1885, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat published their very condensed version of the story of the mystery of the Collins coal mine. Once the Evening Chronicle staff realized they had been scooped, that the Globe-Democrat had somehow had come across the story or rumors of it and decided to run with that story, they panicked and immediately they published the story in their April 8th, 1885 edition without doing their due diligence and checking in it. And again, as the story kind of unfolded, as it came to light, more and more information, as things like the Globe-Democrat questioned whether or not they were real, the Evening Chronicle doubled down and claimed that it had done its due diligence to check with residents since the original story had been published. And only later on did they retract it on April 11th, 1885. Now, in this retraction, the newspaper claimed that Estes was attacked by residents of Moberly. They were so angered over this fake story that they attacked him in the streets. And that Estes later admitted that he made up the story with John G. Provines in order to do 2 things. One, to provide an April Fool's Day hoax to the newspapers to pass time on a slow news day, arguing that Estes crafted the sensationalism of the story and that Provines developed the mythology and antiquity elements of the story to make it seem very realistic. But also, Estes later claimed, according to the Evening Chronicle, that he had made up the story in order to come up with an alibi for his absence from certain responsibilities. Essentially, he couldn't be somewhere because he was, quote, down in the underground, right? End quote. And the Evening Chronicle said that Estes later left Moberly in disgrace and headed for parts unknown. Now, this is another mystery added to the story because Estes, later on, as we know, works for the Headlight, is connected with Moberly newspapers for a portion of the rest of the 1880s. He is a writer for the Missouri General Assembly there in 1887, and it is not until the late 1880s that he moves out of Moberly and later relocates to Texas. He developed a series of health issues and ultimately passed away near San Antonio in 1889. So it seems that, anyways, he's not run out of town, but instead kind of bears the brunt of the story initially, and later it becomes a bit of a laughing matter. Now, what happens to the story after that point in time? Well, in many ways, the only person seemingly hurt by the story was Tim Collins. Not only did he have to dispute the story in the press over the years, but he was engaged in a number of legal, longstanding campaigns over ownership of this Tim Collins coal mine. It was called the Collins coal mine for many, many years, but there was a constant dispute over who really owned the rights to the land and thus to the mining rights underneath the ground. And he went to court several times in order to claim access to the land and ownership of the land. And this continues well on into the late 19th century and into the turn of the 20th century. By this point in time, Tim Collins is living in Oklahoma, or what is today Oklahoma, then called Indian Territory, listed in the 1900 census as a mineralogist, living with his son in portions of what is today Oklahoma, where he died soon after that, not too long after that story came out. Now, what is the historical memory of this Collins's coal mine? Well, later on, the story came up again and again in a number of newspapers, as there were anniversaries of the event and a number of other incidences. So in 1905, when John G. Provines passes away, it prompts the Macon Republican to retell Colonel Provine's fine yarn, which is about Missouri's Pompeii and how the whole world made eager inquiry about his remarkable buried city, detailing not only his life and his role in the newspaper business, but how this story became a worldwide sensation. In 1925, when there were rumors that there were artifacts and treasures in a buried city discovered near Bowling Green, Missouri, on the eastern half of the state, it prompted a lot of newspapers to recall with warning the story of Collins's coal mine, noting one that Moberly had once had a buried city that put the town on the map, but also that perhaps not all that is heard is to be believed. And finally, and perhaps the most ironic element of the entire story, in 1897, the Omaha World Herald published a short story about Collins's coal mine, noting the sensationalism of it in 1885, how it had traveled around the globe with the story, how it had been a hoax, and how it had been something that had caught people's attention from Moberly to the far corners of the earth. And concluding in all of this, it called it, quote, the greatest of all fakes, end quote. Thank you very much.
They want to know what led you to this topic.
So with every Missouri mystery, the question that always comes out afterwards is, what's the next one going to be? And I usually, luckily, have about 12 months to develop the next subject matter. But this one was kind of intriguing. I had heard about this story before, but I didn't know a lot about it. I just kind of heard bits and pieces here and there of this mythical buried city underneath Moberly, Missouri. So I was intrigued by the story of what had happened in 1885. And then I wanted to do my due diligence, as I do with a lot of these programs, of telling the legend, telling the story, sorting out fact from fiction, and also looking at the historic memory of it. So it was great that the Historical Society had copies of 1885's Evening Chronicle from St. Louis. So I was able to look at the original articles in and of themselves. I was able to go through newspapers.com and look at how various newspapers covered the story. And I was able to then kind of dive in and look at the individuals involved with John G. Provines, John W. Estes, Tim Collins himself, and of course this Britton A. Hill that became this kind of notable figure in all this. So it's really fascinating to kind of look into it based upon a story I'd heard in the past and the ability to kind of look at the research and develop something more beyond that for this presentation.
Great. Mike J. is curious why initial reports appeared in the Evening Chronicle and not Moberly Headlight. He says, seems like a sensational story would have just been first broken by its local reporter.
Exactly. That's a great point. So what the story goes along with this is that Estes was a correspondent in Central Missouri for the Evening Chronicle. And thus, what the argument was from the Chronicle as well as from Estes and the retellings of it was that he sent it to the Evening Chronicle as a joke, right, as an April Fool's Day joke, and arguing in that letter, as I kind of said before, that local newspaper coverage were just kind of avoiding it. They were overlooking it. They were not saying, I'm trying to think what they said. The original words were um, that it was essentially getting meager coverage in local newspapers. So thus, he doesn't tip his hand that it's not in the headlight, although it seemingly is not, although I can't track down copies of the headlight to see if it was in there or not, but I believe it was not. But more so that it was saying it was getting meager coverage in local press, and he sent it on, noting that it's going to cost them for the story. They're going to pay him for the story. So he sent it to the Evening Chronicle, knowing they would pay him for the story. If he could write a sensational story, it would be 2 or 3 columns. He's going to get very well paid from this story and hope that no one catches on that it's an entire myth of it. So that's why it gets coverage in the Evening Chronicle and not so much in local Moberly papers at the time.
Sure. And Sarah M. wants to know, what was the resource that kind of helped piece all this story together for you?
So the biggest one was copies of the Evening Chronicle, being able to look at the stories because they were reprinted in other newspapers, but the Evening Chronicle was the most important one, which is why these newspapers are so great that they're archived here at the Society, because I can go back and look at newspaper coverage and know that it's going to be early April of 1885, and I can look and see how different newspapers cover it, both here at the Center for Missouri Studies, but also through things like Chronicling America. I can look at newspapers.com, which we partner with, and really get an idea of how this story is covered. And that's where I was able to go back and see, you know, I could see the April 6th edition of the Globe Democrat telling the story. And then I was curious why it was April 8th that it was coming out in the Evening Chronicle. And that's what really confused me at first was, why is it coming out later on in the newspaper it's attributed to, but another newspaper has broken the story first? And that's where the retraction of April 11th comes into play, because they laid out essentially what happened in chronological order to explain how the letter came to them, how they were scooped of it, and ultimately how they retracted the story later on. So the newspapers were extremely valuable in being able to tell the story.
Great. And Matthew L. says, do you have any idea what happened to the artifacts brought to the surface by the parties? Did they actually exist in the first place?
That is a bit of a mystery in of itself. As some had said, they thought some of the artifacts were from nearby Native American mounds in the region. So some of the stuff that they had shown people could have been from those mounds, but by all accounts, the story was a complete hoax, and thus the tools, the skeleton, the statues and the idols that were claimed to be down there were not true, were not real, and were most likely repurposed from other things in and around Moberly and said to have come from the mine. So they were probably just local materials that were just basically given a new title, a new history, a new story, and then utilized to show people that they had really made this discovery in Collins's coal mine.
Great. And Janet L. asks, what eventually happened to the Collins mine? Is it still accessible today?
As far as I can tell, and I would trust residents of Moberly better than myself on this one, but as far as I can tell, I was looking at Sanborn insurance maps from the early 1900s, and in those cases, the areas of North Alt Street seemingly stopped in terms of their street by street focus by the 1920s. So I wasn't able to see how far up on North Alt Street it was. But from later newspaper articles, it seems that portions of the land were sold away to residents to build homes on. So it's quite possible that portions of the mine were filled in over time by just simply, erosion, deterioration of the mine, things like that. So it seems like it was subterranean, so it wouldn't have had a huge kind of hill to go into. It would have been simply digging under the ground. So as far as I can tell, that's where it is at in Moberly. But as of right now, I suspect it is probably buried under in a series of neighborhood homes, if I take a guess. But I could be wrong.
Rachel S. asks, did any other legend stories come out of this story of the Collins mine that you know?
The biggest one of that was just the story in 1925 of apparently a buried city near Bowling Green, Missouri, which I believe that's, I'm sorry, people of Bowling Green, I believe that's Pike County. I could be wrong. I think that's Pike County, Missouri. Um, and that was where people began to report the story. That was the only other mystery associated with that, of people giving a warning of like, hey, before you sell the story and circulate it, remember what happened in Moberly in 1885. But there was a lot of callbacks, like I said, to Pompeii, to the Mayan ruins in Mexico. So those are a lot of the connections of that as being told today, of being kind of Missouri's Pompeii or being Americans' Pompeii in 1885 with Moberly. But most of it was being drawn back there forward in time to 1925 to the alleged discovery, which I have not searched yet, of the mysterious buried city in Bowling Green, Missouri.
Sure, we have time for a couple more questions. JS asks, what was the most surprising thing to you when you were doing your research and compiling this story?
I think the most surprising thing was just how far the coverage went. I mean, one of the great things about newspaper research and digital newspaper databases is the ability to do keyword searches and to see how far things go. I always like to do that with a lot of my stories. I like to see how far the story travels, even if it's just a short little write up in newspapers. I always want to see how something so localized gets attention both statewide, nationwide, and even internationally. So I did some keyword searches of, Collins coal mine, Moberly, buried city, Moberly, or just even just simply Moberly in a lot of these international newspapers, or looked at that certain date to see how they were covered. And I think that's the most fascinating thing, was that it does get picked up beyond the boundaries of the United States, and that people are intrigued by the story and seemingly, as far as I can tell, don't get the hoax part of the story. They get the initial story, but they don't get the hoax, the truth telling at the end of it. So that's kind of intriguing in the story of that it gets such a widespread reach in 1885 of this story for a lot of people. It could have been a slow news day, could have been people looking to fill their pages. I don't know, but it gets a widespread coverage.
Sure. And last question you get asked every time. Will you be coming back next year for another installment? And what will your topic be?
I love Missouri Mysteries. It has been so much fun. It's one of my favorite parts of the job here. Yes, I will commit to doing a chapter 6. I do not know what the theme is going to be right now. I have some in my mind. People always want to know. I always keep it a secret. I keep it a mystery until we do the next presentation, so that I don't get scooped like the Evening Chronicle did by the Globe Democrat, and that I have something original to come out in October of 2025. So look forward to seeing everyone then for that one. And yes, there will be a chapter 6 of Missouri Mysteries.
Great. Thank you, Sean, for your presentation. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this virtual program. Remember that this will be recorded and put on our on-demand webpage on shsmo.org at a later date. And you can also check up for our upcoming events on the calendar tab of the SHSMO website as well. Everybody have a spooky October, and we'll see you later. Bye.